Welcome to the American Academy of Grief Counseling's Videogram on Black grief and minority trauma in the United States. And this video serves as a way to review these types of grief and losses experienced within various minority communities, as well as to look at a short history of why in the United States there has been these types of issues, and also a way grief counselors can look and be aware of these particular griefs and collective losses and individual losses that exist within these diverse and unique communities. So I think the first thing to remember is minorities suffer differently. What the traditional European descent American goes through on a daily basis is quite different than what minorities go through. Minorities suffer a collective grief with a collective history of injustice, as well as a personal grief that still exists to some extent today as well. And that's seen in the news quite a bit when we see various cases of police brutality or individuals of Asian descent being beaten on the side of the road itself. So with that comes a particular type of collective identity with a collective grief that is stamped upon them in itself. So first, let's take a look at the African American minority itself. And what we refer to it is as Black grief. And Black grief is a collective thing that is covered upon any African American by just being African American itself. So the past and collective trauma that has existed within the United States due to the African slave trade has led to a variety of inequalities that have spawned through the last 150 years. In addition to that, anytime you turn on the news, there could be a police beating where police brutality takes place, or profiling itself, where an individual of a certain color is walking in the wrong neighborhood. And because they're in the wrong neighborhood, they're asked more questions than a white person would be asked. African Americans also have unequal access to health care and certain medications. There are neighborhoods that have grown and developed over time that are African American identity and closely correlated with poverty. And because of that, they are purposely left in the middle without access to better facilities that are found in better neighborhoods themselves. So these types of stressors exist within many minority minds, especially the African American, in regards to what we're talking about. And it causes anxiety, depression, and it can also be hypervigilance, where someone is extremely more nervous, very similar to PTSD, when maybe being pulled over by a police officer than, say, a white person or someone as myself of my color would be. So it is something that is inherently wrong with a system that started off bad. And this is what has caused what we call Black inequality. So even though African Americans since the Civil Rights Movement have advanced to civic and professional positions in society, even though we've had Barack Obama, first Black president, even though there are many police chiefs in major cities that are African American, there still remains an inherent inequality at a subconscious level, I think, in regards to police profiling and jobs itself, especially when pulling over individuals. And in some cases, it can even be an African American cop pulling over just a simple African American man. There is that inherent thought that due to a certain race, that there's a certain type of poverty, and that because of that poverty, there's a certain element being tied to crime itself. So there is more of a suspect feeling, which is totally unjustified in itself. So while socially racism is unacceptable in the United States, it still very much remains a reality. in the United States in dark circles, and maybe some prejudices at a very subconscious level that individuals don't even know they are applying. And again, because of this, because of slavery and its unjust system that shackled an entire people just based on their race, once these individuals were freed after the Civil War, after the Emancipation Proclamation itself, individuals of African American descent still faced an upward battle due to the poverty that they inherited. And that was carried on into the 20th century. Many of their properties were taken away from them, or illegal, or through financial shady dealings taken away from them, which would have happened to a family of European descent itself. So this keeps Africans caught in a vicious cycle, African Americans caught in a vicious cycle of poverty itself. Now, this is not to condone irresponsibility in one's individual life. You still are called to do good, but there is an inherent problem that prevents many African American families from excelling as easily as those of European descent because of the history, because of the induced poverty. So yes, individuals are called to do well, to work hard, be responsible, but still there has to be an acknowledgement of that type of Black grief that exists, that causes this type of inequality. And I think recently with COVID, it was really seen how, due to financial planning over the last 150 years, or community planning, how access to healthcare, access to better facilities were purposely left out of African American communities itself. Now, Native Americans share their own unique grief as well as African Americans. Native Americans experience a grief really of past pride that has been stolen from them. So this continent once belonged to the Native Americans. It belonged to Native indigenous tribes. And sometimes even the term American being used within these tribes is an offense that refers to those who came and those who stole. And unfortunately, European powers played a horrible role in destroying the culture and the land that belonged to the Native Americans. But our own country, the United States, played an even more devastating role in completing it, where there were cases of genocide and forced relocation. And I think that is really best described in the Trail of Tears, where many of the Seminole tribes of Florida were relocated to the Plain States. And then after the Plain States, they were further relocated to reservations further out west, each time taking more illegally. And that is one of the black eyes that exist within the history of the United States. So with this genocide, with this relocation, there is a shadow of what these tribes once were politically. And within these tribes exist an intense pride themselves still of who they are. But because of the collective grief that exists within the community and what was taken, there still is a lot of suicide, substance abuse that exists within these groups, and also in a constant struggle of maintaining identity and heritage, and understanding how important and how critical that identity and heritage is in fighting back against what was taken. Maybe the land was taken, but the soul of the Native American tribes can never be taken in itself. Asian American grief also exists at a collective level. We only need to turn to recent history, unfortunately, in the World War II, where the internment camps were done for anyone who looked Japanese. So that involved anyone who was Chinese, Korean, and even then, Japanese individuals who were good American citizens. Anyone of that was taken. Now, this type of racism still exists today with the coronavirus, and a lot of them would refer to it as the Chinese flu. And when referring to it with these types of nationality labels, it makes individuals who are of Asian descent an easier target in itself. And in recent news, we've seen this type of collective hate being imposed upon individuals that are Asian, being beaten on the side of the road, or even in public, hit or smacked. And this is something that is also a big problem. So we have major issues in this country in regards to how minorities are treated, and this in turn creates a collective grief that grief counselors need to be aware of. But when we look at the United States, for most European Americans, we're taught of a great story, a great experiment, the American experiment. And we're coming to a situation in American history today where there's many who want to go back and rewrite history, or others who want to hide history itself. So either they want to hide or they want to rewrite. And we come to a lot of problems because we as Americans are trying to justify the past and not condemn what we're supposed to be so proud of. We're supposed to be proud of the flag. We're supposed to feel that America is the greatest nation ever to exist. So while democracy and freedom were good inventions through the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, it obviously wasn't for all. The first moment that an individual who was African American was considered 3/5 of a person, there was obviously an issue. Within this European descent club only, Americans saw themselves as a city on the hill with a manifest destiny to take Americanism all the way to the West Coast, no matter what type of individuals were in the way, whether they were Native Americans or whether they were people of tan and brown color, such as Spanish or Mexicans. It didn't matter. America had a destiny because she was the city on the hill. And this is where we get WASP culture, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And this type of culture saw itself at America as the best nation that could ever exist, and that others who came to devalue the WASP culture, to dilute the WASP culture, they were threats to that city on the hill in itself. And through that came the Know Nothing Party in the mid 1800s. And the Know Nothing Party was a party based basically of white nationalists who were against immigration, much like we see today. They were against Irish Catholics because within WASP, the P stands for Protestant. So Irish Catholics were the first to be hated. And as today, we see Latin Americans being hated in a revival of this WASP culture. Interestingly enough, it's the Ku Klux Klan that emerged from the Know Nothing Party, and it had its greatest emergence after the Civil War and during the Reconstruction, and then again in the 1920s, and then again during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. This beast still exists, unfortunately, causing collective grief to many minority groups itself. Today, there is that resurfacing of white extremism, white nationalism. And unfortunately, much of it is weaponizing Christianity and making it a very pharisaical Christianity that is poisoned at the well in itself. So what we're seeing is destructive extremes tearing this nation apart, where individuals want to become either woke or completely blind. They want to either erase the past, or others wish to revise the past. And this comes into a big problem for minority groups who have a collective grief, who are injured from America's past, and how historic figures are reviewed, how monuments are reviewed, how historic dates are remembered, or how historic dates are titled, such as Columbus Day or now Natives Day, or creating Juneteenth as an Emancipation Day to be remembered. So there are a variety of ways where history in schools is being either not taught properly or completely revised. And there's a fear that if we do not, we're not critical of our forefathers, if we are critical of our forefathers, then we're not respecting them. And I think that needs to be eliminated from the discussion. You can still have respect for the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the American idea, and how it has evolved, but you can still teach children that there was inherent issues with it. Now, I believe that many of those within the woke culture want to completely eliminate monuments. They want to completely remove veneration for some of our founding fathers. And I think that's taken it a step too far. But at the same time, there's those who want to not hide the sins of the past. And if you do that, then how is one able to learn from the past? Yeah, the very fact that most of the forefathers, if not all of them, owned slaves to some extent. That's something that should be disavowed, and that's something that young children or those in history classes in middle school should be taught and say, we can still respect these individuals, but they made these types of mistakes. Heroes can make mistakes, and they can be ridiculed for those past mistakes. So I don't think we want to turn a blind eye, but we also don't want to become a complete erasing culture of what we see in many things with monuments and things. Some things I think are open to debate to be changed. Other things I think have to remain intact, just because of the fact that it's history. Like it, love it, or hate it, it is history in itself. We can learn from it and become better through it. This is where patriotism versus nationalism again comes in. Patriotism is love of nation, but also understanding a nation's faults, and also looking to be better and to love other heritages, to love other peoples. Nationalism instead is something that started World War I. It feels that one nation is better than the other, and within that nation there's a certain identity only, and if you don't fit the narrative of that identity, then there is an issue. So I think loving one nation is important, remembering the past, but looking to improve the future by understanding that the past isn't as good as we once thought, but that's okay. And I think that is the big lesson we want to take from that. So there is a huge collective grief that exists, that hovers over those of Asian descent, African American descent, Native American descent, and there are hurdles that we as a society have to cross in terms of identifying what it is to be an American, knowing that the past isn't as rosy as we once thought, but that's okay, and moving forward and doing things a lot better. But as grief counselors, when working with these particular types of individuals, I think it's important to understand the particular battles that they face with hate crimes, with police brutality, profiling, and just the overall sense of insecurity that can come with that, and all the emotional things that can adhere from that. So if you're not of that particular race or ethnic background, such as myself, as being a European American, I think we need, as European American counselors, to be a lot more open to other experiences and how those experiences manifest differently from our particular own. And for those of other minority descent that are already counselors, they already have an understanding of this, and they're better able to implement it in helping others. So below is our grief counseling certification link, also our grief diversity program. Don't forget about GC 760. Our email is info@aihcp.org, and our phone number is 330-652-7776. I'd like to thank you for listening, and have a good day.